Life stories, where every moment holds a lesson, and every story touches your heart. Today's tale is one of love, redemption, and the power of second chances. Meet Jason, a millionaire whose life seems perfect from the outside but is empty within. A chance encounter with a young boy named Jacob sets him on an unexpected journey, a journey that leads him back to family, to healing, and to hope. Get ready to be inspired by a story that reminds us that it's never too late to rebuild what's been lost. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. The streets of the city were a symphony of sounds, honking cars, hurried footsteps, and snippets of conversations blending into the hum of urban life. Jason Hayes walked with his usual briskness, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement. His charcoal grey suit was immaculately tailored. His Rolex gleamed under the fading afternoon sun, and his phone was pressed to his ear as he barked orders to an assistant. No, that's not acceptable," he said sharply, weaving past pedestrians with practiced efficiency. "The merger needs to happen this quarter. Make it work." Jason Hayes was a man who exuded success, his every move deliberate and calculated. Yet, if you looked closer, you'd see something missing. His eyes, tired and distant, betrayed the weight of isolation beneath his polished exterior. As Jason passed a bustling coffee shop, a faint melody broke through the cacophony of the street, a tune so familiar that it stopped him in his tracks. He turned his head, startled, and saw a boy sitting cross-legged on the pavement. The child couldn't have been older than 8. His frame small and wiry. He wore sneakers that were too big for him and a tattered t-shirt that had seen better days. Yet his bright eyes sparkled with concentration as he sketched on a crumpled piece of paper. The boy was humming, softly and almost absent-mindedly, a lullaby Jason hadn't heard in years. The sound brought with it memories Jason thought he had long buried, a nursery painted pale blue, a wooden rocking chair, and a soft tune sung in the quiet of the night. Jason's gaze lingered on the boy longer than usual, an unexplainable unease settling over him. But before he could process the moment, his phone buzzed in his hand. The voice on the other end jolted him back to his meticulously structured reality. With a curt nod to no one in particular, he continued walking, the boy's humming fading into the background. "Get the legal team to review it again," he said into the phone. His tone clipped. "We're not losing this deal." But the encounter had left a mark. That lullaby, that simple, haunting melody, refused to leave Jason's mind. It was as if the boy had unknowingly strummed a chord in Jason's soul, a chord that had been silent for years. The next day, Jason found himself walking the same route. Though he rarely frequented the area more than once a week, his steps slowed as he approached the coffee shop. The boy was there again, seated on the pavement with his drawings spread out in front of him like a makeshift gallery. Each piece was simple yet filled with emotion, a family holding hands, a sunny park, a small house with a picket fence. Jason couldn't help but notice the detail in the drawings, especially in the figure of the father, who bore an uncanny resemblance to himself. As Jason walked past, the boy looked up and smiled, a gap-toothed grin so warm and innocent that it momentarily disarmed him. Jason hesitated, almost stopping, but his feet carried him forward. Yet, as he rounded the corner, his mind lingered on the boy's smile and the quiet determination in his work. That afternoon, Jason sat in his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows flooding the room with light. But instead of focusing on the endless contracts and proposals on his desk, his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy on the sidewalk. Who was he? Why was he there, alone and so absorbed in his drawings? And how did he know that lullaby? Jason shook his head, frustrated with himself. He was a businessman, not a social worker. He had deals to close, targets to hit. But the boy's face, his voice, his art, they had left an impression that Jason couldn't shake. The third day, Jason found himself walking past the coffee shop once more, this time with intention. He noticed the boy had arranged his drawings more neatly, as if preparing for visitors. But as Jason approached, he saw the boy sway unsteadily. Before Jason could react, the boy's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the pavement. Jason's briefcase fell to the ground as he rushed forward, kneeling beside the child. "Hey, can you hear me?" Jason asked, his voice unusually soft. The boy's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his young face. "I'm okay," he mumbled. "Just a little dizzy." Jason steadied the boy's shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "When's the last time you ate something?" The boy didn't answer. His silence was all the confirmation Jason needed. Looking around, Jason spotted a deli across the street. With a sigh that was equal parts frustration and concern, he helped the boy to his feet. "Come on, kid," he said. "Let's get you something to eat." Inside the deli, the boy hesitated, his wide eyes scanning the room as if it were an unfamiliar luxury. Jason ordered 2 sandwiches and some water, ignoring the curious stares of the staff. As they sat by the window, Jason noticed how carefully the boy ate, taking small, deliberate bites as if savoring each one. His drawings sat neatly stacked beside him, their edges worn but their contents vibrant. "Are these yours?" Jason asked, gesturing to the papers. The boy nodded. "I like to draw what I see," he said softly, "and sometimes what I wish I could see." Jason felt a pang in his chest. There was a quiet wisdom in the boy's voice, a resilience that belied his young age. He picked up one of the drawings, a family playing in a park, their faces filled with joy. The simplicity of the image was profoundly moving. "You're pretty good," Jason said, surprising himself with the compliment. The boy's face lit up, his earlier hesitation melting away. "Thank you. Miss Sarah at the shelter gives me paper when she can. Someday, I want to be a real artist." Jason listened, feeling a strange pull toward this child, a pull he couldn't explain. As they finished their meal, Jason walked the boy back to the shelter. The modest building with peeling paint seemed worlds away from the skyscrapers Jason usually inhabited. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," the boy said quietly, clutching his drawings. His smile, though faint, was genuine. Jason nodded stiffly, already reaching for his phone as it buzzed with another call. But as he walked away, the boy's voice, his art, and that haunting lullaby stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of Jason's carefully constructed world. Something about this child, this stranger, was drawing Jason into a story he wasn't ready to confront, but one he couldn't ignore. Jason Hayes wasn't the kind of man to dwell on things. Yet, as he sat in his sleek corner office later that week, he found his thoughts returning to the boy on the sidewalk. The memories of their brief encounter lingered like an unfinished sentence, refusing to fade. Jason, usually decisive and composed, found himself unsettled. It wasn't just the boy's bright, hopeful eyes or his humble talent for drawing. It was the lullaby, a melody that Jason hadn't heard in years but that still managed to pierce through the armor he'd built around himself. He told himself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But the nagging doubt wouldn't let go. By the following week, Jason had rerouted his morning walks to pass the coffee shop daily, though he would never admit he was looking for the boy. And then, one afternoon, as the late autumn sun cast long shadows across the pavement, Jason saw him again. The boy was sitting on the same sidewalk corner, humming softly while carefully adding details to one of his drawings. This time, Jason didn't walk past. "Hey," Jason said, standing a few feet away, unsure why he had stopped. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to say. The boy looked up, startled at first, but then his expression softened into the same shy smile he'd given Jason before. "Hi, mister." Jason gestured toward the drawings scattered in front of the boy. "You've been busy." The boy nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I'm always drawing. It makes the day go faster." Jason hesitated before lowering himself to a crouch, his tailored suit brushing the edge of the pavement. He picked up a drawing of a small house surrounded by trees. A picket fence out front. It was simple yet oddly familiar. "Do you always draw houses like this?" Jason asked, his voice softer than usual. "Not always." The boy shrugged. "But I like to draw families. Even if I don't have one. It makes me feel like I do." Jason's throat tightened. There was no bitterness in the boy's tone. Only a matter-of-fact acceptance that made the statement even more heartbreaking. "What's your name?" Jason asked, his voice quieter now. "Jacob," the boy replied. "But people call me Jake." Jacob. The name hung in the air like a bell Jason couldn't unring. He looked at the boy more closely. At the gap-toothed smile. The faint dimple in his left cheek. There was something achingly familiar about him. Something Jason couldn't quite place, but that made his heart beat a little faster. "Do you live here?" Jason asked, nodding toward the shelter down the block. Jacob nodded. "For now. It's not bad. Miss Sarah says I can stay until I find a foster home." The words hit Jason harder than he expected. Foster home. The phrase echoed in his mind, stirring memories he had buried under years of work and success. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to maintain his composure. "Well, Jacob," Jason said, rising to his full height, "you keep working on these drawings. You've got real talent." Jacob's face lit up. "You think so?" Jason nodded. "I do." He turned to leave, but something stopped him. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp bill, holding it out to Jacob. "Here. 4 more paper." Jacob hesitated, his fingers hovering near the money. "I can't take that." "Sure you can," Jason said. "Think of it as an investment." Jacob's face broke into a smile as he took the bill carefully, as though it might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Thank you, mister." Jason nodded and walked away, his chest tight. The boy's voice. The house he drew. The tune he hummed, it all swirled in Jason's mind like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. That evening, as Jason sat in his penthouse overlooking the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob was more than just a chance encounter. There was something deeper at play. A connection he couldn't explain but could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, Jason allowed himself to remember. He thought of his ex-wife, Olivia, and the life they had built and lost together. He thought of the baby they had once dreamed of, the family they had planned before everything fell apart. And as he remembered, the truth that had been quietly creeping into his heart became impossible to deny. The boy wasn't just a stranger. Jacob was his son. Jason Hayes spent the entire night grappling with the revelation. He sat in his study, the city lights outside twinkling like distant stars. But he barely noticed the memory of Jacob's face, his smile, the gap in his teeth. The dimple was etched in Jason's mind. He couldn't deny it anymore. Jacob was his son. But how? How had this child ended up on the streets? In a shelter? While Jason had been obliviously consumed by his relentless pursuit of wealth and success. The questions came like a flood, each one heavier than the last. Jason picked up his phone and stared at it for a long time before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Soft but wary. "Hello, Olivia," Jason said, his voice catching. There was a long pause. "Jason, why are you calling me after all this time?" "I need to talk to you," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "It's important." "Jason, I don't." "Please," he interrupted. "It's about Jacob." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Jason wondered if the call had disconnected. Then Olivia's voice came, trembling and raw. "Where did you hear that name?" Jason took a deep breath. "I've met him. Olivia. I didn't realize it at first. But I know now. He's my son." "Isn't he?" There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by a choked sob. "Jason, this isn't something we can discuss over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow?" They agreed on a quiet cafe near Olivia's neighborhood. Jason hardly slept that night. his mind churning with fragments of his past with Olivia. He remembered their early days. The laughter. The plans. The love that had once bound them together. And then he remembered the cracks, the arguments. The distance. And the divorce that had left them both broken. The next afternoon, Jason arrived at the cafe early. He chose a secluded table in the corner, far from the other patrons. When Olivia walked in, Jason almost didn't recognize her. She looked different, her dark hair was shorter, her face framed by tiny lines of age and weariness. But her eyes, still so familiar, held a depth of sadness that Jason hadn't seen before. "Jason," she said softly, sitting across from him. "Olivia." He nodded, his voice stiff. "Thank you for meeting me." She stirred honey into her tea, her hands trembling slightly. "So," she said, her voice brittle. "Jacob." Jason leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "He's my son." "Isn't he?" Olivia looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "Yes. He's your son." Jason closed his eyes, the confirmation hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You weren't there, Jason," Olivia said, her voice rising slightly. "After the divorce, you threw yourself into work. You didn't even notice how much you were missing. When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone emotionally, if not physically. I was on my own." Jason's jaw tightened. "That doesn't mean I didn't have a right to know." "And what would you have done?" she snapped. "Would you have given up your career, your empire, to be a father? Or would you have sent a check every month and left me to handle everything alone?" Her words cut deep, but Jason couldn't deny their truth. He had been so consumed by ambition that he'd neglected everything else, including Olivia. "I tried to raise him," Olivia continued, her voice breaking. "I really did. But I was drowning. Jason. I couldn't keep a roof over our heads. When Jacob was 3 months old, I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave him up for adoption. I thought he'd have a better life." Jason stared at her, his emotions warring between anger and sorrow. "But he didn't. Did he? He ended up in the system. In a shelter." Tears spilled down Olivia's cheeks. "I didn't know. I thought he'd go to a good family. I thought he'd be happy." Jason leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We failed him," he said quietly. "Both of us." Olivia nodded, her tears falling freely now. "What do we do, Jason? How do we make this right?" Jason met her gaze, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We start by being there for him. Together." In that moment, Jason saw the fragility in Olivia's expression, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. They had both made mistakes, terrible, painful mistakes, but they had a chance now. A chance to give Jacob the family he deserved. And Jason wasn't going to let that chance slip away. Jason left the cafe with a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Guilt and regret weighed heavily on his chest. But beneath it all was a fierce determination. For too long, he had let his past mistakes define him. Now, he had a chance to make things right, not just for Jacob, but for himself and Olivia too. The next morning, Jason stood outside the shelter where Jacob lived, holding a brown paper bag filled with sandwiches and snacks. He had barely slept the night before, his thoughts consumed by the boy who was unknowingly at the center of so much pain and hope. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The shelter's receptionist, a kind woman named Miss Sarah, greeted him with a surprised smile. "Mr. Hayes. Back again?" "Jacob's in the recreation room." Jason nodded and made his way down the dimly lit hallway. The room was filled with the quiet hum of children playing and drawing. But his eyes immediately found Jacob, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a sketchpad in his lap. The boy was completely absorbed, his small hand moving swiftly across the paper. "Jacob," Jason said gently, stepping closer. Jacob looked up, startled at first. But his expression softened when he recognized Jason. "Hi, Mr. Hayes." His voice was bright but cautious. Jason held out the bag of food. "Thought you might be hungry." Jacob's face lit up as he took the bag, his gratitude evident. "Thanks. Miss Sarah said we're not allowed to eat in here, though. Want to sit outside?" Jason nodded, and they found a quiet spot on a bench just outside the shelter. Jacob tore into the sandwich eagerly, and Jason watched him with a mix of pride and sadness. This boy, his son, had been living with so little for so long. "So, Jacob," Jason began after a moment, "how long have you been here?" Jacob shrugged. "About a year, I think. It's not too bad. Miss Sarah's nice. And I get to draw a lot." Jason hesitated, unsure how much to ask. "Do you ever think about family?" Jacob stopped chewing and glanced at Jason warily. "Why?" Jason forced a smile, trying to ease the boy's nerves. "Just curious. I saw some of your drawings, and they're all about families. I figured it must be something important to you." Jacob nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Yeah, I guess. I don't really remember mine. Sometimes I just make them up." Jason's heart ached at the simplicity of Jacob's answer. He wanted to tell him the truth, to explain everything. But he knew it wasn't the right time. Jacob had been let down too many times already. Jason needed to earn his trust first. "Your drawings are incredible," Jason said, changing the subject. "You've got real talent." Jacob perked up at the compliment. "You think so?" "Absolutely," Jason said with genuine enthusiasm. "Have you ever thought about becoming an artist?" Jacob's face brightened, his earlier wariness melting away. "Yeah. Miss Sarah says I could be. Someday. But I'd need real supplies. Not just scraps." Jason made a mental note. "We'll make sure you have everything you need." "We?" Jacob asked, tilting his head. Jason hesitated. "Me. And maybe others who care about you." Jacob studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher the deeper meaning behind the words. But then he smiled. A quiet, hopeful smile that made Jason's heart swell. As they finished their lunch, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had taken the first step, but there was so much more to do. Jacob didn't just need a meal or art supplies, he needed a father, a family. And Jason was determined to give him both. But he couldn't do it alone. Jason thought of Olivia, of the pain in her eyes when she spoke of giving Jacob up. For the first time, he understood the weight of her decision. They both had a responsibility now, to Jacob, and to the family they had once dreamed of creating. Jason reached over and ruffled Jacob's hair, an instinctive gesture that surprised both of them. Jacob laughed. A light, carefree sound that warmed Jason's heart. "Thanks for the sandwich, Mr. Hayes," Jacob said as they stood to leave. "Call me Jason," he said. Then, after a moment, he added softly, "Or whatever you want." Jacob gave him a curious look, but his smile didn't fade. As Jason walked away, he glanced back and saw Jacob waving, his sketchpad tucked under one arm. For the first time in years, Jason felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Jason Hayes wasn't a man accustomed to waiting. But when it came to Jacob, patience was something he was quickly learning. Over the next week, Jason made a point of visiting the shelter every day. He brought art supplies, sketchbooks, pencils, markers, and sat with Jacob as the boy excitedly tested each one. It became their routine. Jason would listen while Jacob talked about his drawings, his dreams, and the world as he saw it. And Jacob slowly grew more comfortable around him. One afternoon, as they sat outside under the shade of a tree, Jacob worked diligently on a new drawing. His small hands moved quickly, the pencil gliding across the page with confidence. Jason watched, fascinated by the boy's talent. "What are you working on today?" Jason asked, leaning closer. Jacob tilted the sketchpad so Jason could see. It was a drawing of a park, filled with children playing and families sitting together. In the corner, a boy sat on a bench with a man beside him, their heads bent close as if sharing a secret. Jason felt his throat tighten. That's beautiful. Jacob. Jacob smiled shyly, his tongue poking out slightly as he added details to the trees. Thanks. I like drawing people together. It makes me happy. Jason hesitated, then asked softly, does it ever make you sad? Thinking about the families you draw? Jacob's hand stilled for a moment. Sometimes, he admitted, not looking up. But mostly, it makes me feel like I'm not alone. Like maybe one day, I'll have a family too. Jason's heart clenched. He wanted to tell Jacob the truth right then and there, to wrap his arms around him and promise that he would never have to feel alone again. But he knew it wasn't the right time. Jacob had built walls around his heart, and Jason needed to tread carefully to earn his trust. Jacob. Jason began, choosing his words carefully. What would you say if I told you I wanted to help you? To make sure you always have what you need. Whether it's art supplies, a place to stay, or people who care about you. Jacob looked up, his eyes wary. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Jason felt the weight of those words. Maybe I don't know everything about you, he said gently. But I'd like to. I see how hard you work, how much you care about the things you create. And I know what it feels like to be alone. To think no one's looking out for you. No one should feel that way. Especially not someone like you. Jacob studied him for a long moment, his gaze searching. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay. It was a small word. But to Jason, it felt monumental. Over the next few days, Jason began to notice subtle changes in Jacob. The boy's laughter came more easily. His smiles were less hesitant. And he started opening up about his life at the shelter. He talked about Miss Sarah, who always saved blank paper for him, and the other kids, some of whom teased him for always drawing. They think it's silly, Jacob said one afternoon as they sat in the park together. They say drawing doesn't matter. Jason shook his head. That's not true. Art matters. It's how people tell stories, how they share their feelings. Your drawings have a way of making people feel something. Jacob. That's a gift. Jacob looked down at his sketchpad, a small smile tugging at his lips. You really think so? I know so, Jason said firmly. One evening, after their usual visit, Jason returned to his penthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. He pulled out his phone and called Olivia. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady. About Jacob. Olivia sighed on the other end. What now, Jason? We can't keep dancing around this, Jason said. He deserves to know the truth. And if we're going to do this, if we're going to be there for him, we need to do it together. There was a long pause, and Jason could hear Olivia's breath hitch. You're right, she said finally. When do we tell him? Jason looked out over the city skyline, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. Soon. But we have to do it the right way. I don't want to hurt him any more than he already has been. We won't, Olivia said softly. We'll figure this out. As Jason hung up, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination. For the first time in years, he was stepping into a role he had once feared. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father. And he was ready to fight for his son. The day Jason decided to tell Jacob the truth felt heavy with anticipation. He and Olivia had spent hours discussing how to approach it, both anxious about the boy's reaction. They wanted to be honest, but gentle. They wanted to reassure Jacob that this wasn't another fleeting promise from adults who couldn't keep their word. This was real, and they were here to stay. Jason picked up Jacob from the shelter that afternoon, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Jacob sat beside him, happily humming as he flipped through his sketchbook. The sound brought a flicker of calm to Jason's nerves. But it wasn't enough to shake his apprehension. When they arrived at the park, Olivia was already waiting for them. She stood near a picnic table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a nervous smile on her face. Jason parked the car and glanced at Jacob. "Ready for some fresh air?" he asked. His voice strained despite his attempt to sound casual. Jacob nodded, hopping out of the car with his sketchbook under his arm. As they approached Olivia, Jacob hesitated, his gaze darting between her and Jason. "Is something wrong?" he asked cautiously. Jason crouched down to Jacob's level, his heart pounding. "Nobody," he said gently. "But there's something we need to talk to you about. Something important." Jacob's brow furrowed as he clutched his sketchbook tighter. "What is it?" Jason exchanged a glance with Olivia, who stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "Jacob," she began, "do you remember when you told me you didn't know much about your family?" Jacob nodded slowly, his eyes filled with confusion. "Well," Olivia continued, "there's a reason for that. And we think you're old enough to know the truth now." Jacob's small frame tensed, and he took a step back. "What truth?" Jason took a deep breath, his throat dry. "Jacob, you're not just any kid to us. You're my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Jacob stared at Jason, his expression frozen in disbelief. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're my son," Jason repeated, his voice breaking slightly. "And Olivia, she's your mom." Jacob's eyes widened as he looked at Olivia. "You're my mom?" he asked, his voice trembling. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." Jacob took another step back, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. You never told me. You left me." His words hit like a punch to Jason's gut. "We didn't want to," Jason said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. "We made mistakes, Jacob. Big ones. But we're here now. And we want to make it right." Jacob's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as he processed the revelation. "You gave me up," he said, his voice breaking. "You left me alone." Olivia reached out, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was doing what was best for you," she said desperately. "I thought you'd have a better life than I could give you." Jacob's face crumpled, and he dropped his sketchbook. "I didn't have a better life," he cried. "I was in the system. No one wanted me." Jason stepped closer, his own eyes brimming with tears. "I'm so sorry, Jacob," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't know. If I had, I never would have let this happen." For a long moment, Jacob didn't say anything. His small body trembled with the weight of his emotions. And Jason and Olivia stood frozen, helplessly watching their son process the truth. Finally, Jacob looked up at them, his eyes red and filled with a mixture of anger and hope. Are you really going to stay? Or is this just another promise you won't keep?" Jason knelt down, his voice firm. "We're staying, Jacob. Forever. I promise you. We're never leaving you again." Olivia joined him, her hand trembling as she reached for Jacob's. "We'll take it one day at a time," she said softly. "However long it takes for you to trust us. We'll be here." Jacob hesitated, his eyes searching theirs for signs of deception. And then, slowly, he took their hands. "Okay," he whispered, his voice shaky. "But you have to mean it." Jason and Olivia nodded in unison, their grip on his small hands tightening as if they were afraid to let go. "We do," Jason said, his voice steady. "We mean it more than anything." In that moment, under the golden light of the setting sun, the three of them stood together, raw, broken, but united. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but they were a family, and that was enough to start. The weeks following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for all three of them. Jason and Olivia worked together to create a sense of stability for Jacob, while Jacob slowly began to navigate the overwhelming reality of his newfound family. Trust didn't come easily. Jacob had learned the hard way not to expect too much from anyone, but Jason and Olivia were determined to show him that this time things were different. Jason started small, carving out time every afternoon to pick Jacob up from the shelter and take him to the park. They'd sit on a bench near the pond, feeding the ducks while Jacob sketched. Sometimes they talked about his drawings or the other kids at the shelter. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them growing in the unspoken moments. One day, as Jason watched Jacob sketch a mother duck leading her ducklings, he asked a question that had been on his mind. "What's your favorite thing to draw, Jacob?" Jacob glanced up, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. "Families," he said simply. Jason nodded, his chest tightening. "Why families?" Jacob shrugged, his gaze returning to his paper. "Because they make me happy. Even if I didn't have one, I always thought, maybe I could draw one into my life." Jason's throat tightened, and he reached over to gently squeeze Jacob's shoulder. "You don't have to draw one anymore, buddy. You have one now." Jacob didn't say anything, but the faint smile that crossed his lips spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Olivia found her own way of connecting with Jacob. She started volunteering at the shelter, helping the kids with art projects and organizing activities. Watching Jacob interact with the younger children filled her with a mix of pride and regret. He was patient, kind, and always quick to offer encouragement, qualities she hadn't had the chance to nurture in him but that had somehow blossomed all the same. One afternoon, as Olivia helped Jacob organize his art supplies in the shelter's recreation room, she decided to take a chance. "Jacob," she said softly, "can I tell you something?" He looked up from his sketchbook, his expression cautious but curious. "Okay." She sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap. "The first time I saw you at the shelter, I didn't know who you were, but there was something about you, something I couldn't explain. And when Jason told me the truth, it was like a piece of me I'd lost had finally come back." Jacob's pencil stilled. "Do you really mean that?" "I do," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "I made a terrible mistake when I gave you up. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I realize now how wrong I was. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. If you'll let me." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Finally, he nodded. "Okay. But it might take a while." Olivia smiled through her own tears. "Take all the time you need." As the days turned into weeks, Jacob's walls began to lower. He started bringing his drawings to Jason's penthouse, shyly pinning them to the refrigerator or propping them on shelves. The once sterile space began to feel warmer, more alive, with Jacob's art bringing splashes of color and personality to every corner. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Jacob surprised them both. "Can we all draw something together?" he asked, holding up a fresh sketchpad. Jason laughed nervously. "I'm not exactly an artist." "Neither am I," Olivia added with a smile. "But I'm willing to try." Jacob grinned and handed them pencils. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be us." And so, for the first time, the three of them sat together, sketching side by side. Jason's attempts at trees were laughable, and Olivia's stick figures were far from graceful. But Jacob didn't care. He beamed as he watched them try, their laughter filling the room. When they finished, Jacob held up the drawing, a family portrait. Imperfect but heartfelt. Jason, Olivia, and Jacob, drawn together with care and love. "This is my favorite," Jacob said softly, tracing the lines with his finger. Jason pulled him into a hug, his voice thick with emotion. "Mine too, buddy." And as they sat there, the weight of their shared past began to lift, replaced by the fragile but powerful beginnings of a new future. For the first time, they truly felt like a family. Jacob's life was beginning to change in ways he had never dared to imagine. The days of living with uncertainty at the shelter were being replaced by a growing sense of belonging. Jason and Olivia were committed to building a stable foundation for their son. And Jacob, though cautious, was slowly allowing himself to trust that their love was real. One crisp Saturday morning, Jason suggested they visit an art supply store downtown. "You deserve proper tools for your work," he told Jacob as they pulled up in front of the brightly lit shop. Jacob's eyes widened as they stepped inside. Shelves lined with every imaginable art supply stretched before him, rows of pristine sketchbooks, cases of vibrant paints, and racks of brushes that seemed to sparkle under the warm lights. "Pick anything you want," Jason said with a smile, watching Jacob's awestruck expression. "Anything?" Jacob whispered, almost as if he didn't believe it. "Anything," Jason affirmed. Jacob moved carefully through the aisles, his fingers brushing over the supplies with reverence. He picked out a leather-bound sketchbook, a set of professional pencils, and a box of colored pastels. Olivia added a sturdy art bag to their basket, perfect for carrying his growing collection. When they returned to Jason's penthouse, Jacob spent the afternoon organizing his new tools. Jason and Olivia sat nearby, quietly watching as their son meticulously arranged his supplies. The sight of him so content, so focused, filled their hearts with a quiet pride. That evening, during dinner, Jason cleared his throat and looked at Jacob. "I have an idea I want to share with you," he began, his tone careful. "How would you feel about moving in with me? Permanently?" Jacob froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "You mean, live here? All the time?" Jason nodded. "Yes. I want you to have a real home, Jacob. A place where you feel safe and loved." Jacob glanced at Olivia, who smiled gently. "You don't have to decide right away," she said. "But just know that we both want what's best for you." Jacob set his fork down, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. "What about the other kids at the shelter? They don't have families. It doesn't feel fair." Jason leaned forward, his voice soft. "I know it's hard to leave them behind, but that doesn't mean you can't still visit, or even help them. You can always go back and share your art, your time, your kindness." Jacob thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said finally, "but can I still bring my drawings to the shelter?" "Of course," Jason said, his heart swelling with relief. "We can even start something new for the kids there if you'd like." A spark lit up in Jacob's eyes. "Like an art class?" Jason grinned. "Exactly. You'd be the perfect teacher." The following week, Jason and Olivia met with the shelter staff to discuss the idea. Miss Sarah, the shelter's director, was thrilled. "Jacob has always been a role model for the younger kids," she said. "An art class would mean the world to them." With Jason's resources, Olivia's organizational skills, and Jacob's enthusiasm, the art program quickly became a reality. They cleared out a small room at the shelter and stocked it with supplies, sketchpads, crayons, watercolors, and brushes. On the day of the first class, Jacob stood in front of a group of eager children, his sketchbook in hand. His voice trembled at first, but as he began to explain how to draw simple shapes, his confidence grew. By the end of the hour, the room was filled with laughter and bright, colorful creations. As the kids showed off their drawings, Jason and Olivia watched from the back of the room. "His amazing," Olivia whispered, her eyes brimming with pride. Jason nodded, his gaze fixed on Jacob. "His more than amazing," he said. "His resilient. His kind. His everything I could have hoped for in a son." That night, as they sat on the balcony of the penthouse, Jacob turned to Jason and Olivia. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Jason asked. "For this," Jacob replied, gesturing to the city skyline, the warmth of the home behind them, and the love that now surrounded him. "For everything." Jason wrapped an arm around Jacob's shoulders, pulling him close. "We're the ones who should be thanking you, buddy. You've brought us back together and reminded us what really matters." Jacob leaned into him, his heart finally at peace. For the first time in his young life, he felt certain of one thing: he was home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the city skyline, Jason, Olivia, and Jacob sat together on the balcony of their home. The laughter of the day lingered in the air, and Jacob's latest drawing, a family portrait filled with color and joy, rested proudly on the table. For the first time, their hearts felt whole, their bond stronger than ever. "We've come so far," Jason said softly, looking at Olivia and Jacob. "And it's only the beginning," Olivia replied, her eyes glistening. Jacob smiled, leaning into his dad's embrace. "I think this is my best drawing yet," he said, holding up his masterpiece. "It's perfect," Jason said, his voice filled with pride. It wasn't just a story of second chances, it was proof that love, forgiveness, and resilience could bring a family together. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming tales.